Welcome to the National Center on Response to Interventions webinar on Iowa's application of rubrics to evaluate screening and progress tools. My name is John Hosp. I'm the Associate Professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning. I'm a member of the Technical Review Committee for Screening Tools as part of the NCRTI and also an NCRTI trainer. This webinar is designed to share the rubrics for evaluating screening and progress tools that were developed by the Iowa Department of Education in collaboration with others, and to describe the process that was used in applying the rubrics to evaluate these tools. So the purpose of this review was the Iowa Department of Education conducted a survey of universal screening and progress tools that are currently being used across the state of Iowa. And what they found was that there's a great deal of variation across the state in what tools were being used. So the Department of Education started to review the tools for technical adequacy, checking the National Center on Response to Interventions tools charts. In many of the tools that were used across the state had not been submitted to the tools charts. Also, the Department of Education determined that they needed to make evaluative judgments about characteristics that were considered descriptive in the NCRTI tools charts. Characteristics such as cost, time of administration. Part of the reason is because one of these tools, or a portion of the tool at each grade level, will be incorporated into a new state database. Part of this data system will include access to one tool, not necessarily the same tool from the same publisher at each grade level, into the system so that every school district across the state of Iowa will have access to the consistent materials. So because every single school district will have access, there are approximately 500,000 students in K through 12 in Iowa. At a cost of more than $3 per student, this would be a recurring cost of $1.5 million. This is one of the things that made costs an important consideration. But also, many educators in the state are concerned about the time that they're spending on assessment of various purposes, and they want to be able to do it more efficiently. So the need for evaluating the time of administration was also important. This was a collaborative effort. The Iowa Department of Education was the primary source. They had worked closely with individuals from the area education agencies across Iowa and contracted with the National Center on Response to Intervention to have both Dr. Erica Lemke from the University of Missouri and myself assist in the development process. The Iowa Department of Education and personnel from the area education agencies are the ones who then ultimately conducted the reviews. The review process consisted of three different groups. There was a core group, which was composed of Iowa Department of Ed staff who are responsible for the administration and coordination of the full effort of reviews. There was a vetting group who included other Iowa Department of Ed staff, as well as stakeholders from school districts and AEAs and institutes of higher ed from across the state. And last was the work group. Iowa Department of Ed and AEA staff were the ones who conducted the actual reviews and provided the information that the vetting group then had to judge before it was released. Overall in the process, the work group was divided into three groups. Group A was the on-the-ground expertise group. They were the ones who had expertise in how the details of the tools might affect practice or might be incorporated into best practice. They were responsible for practitioner considerations, key elements about the tools such as descriptive information, what it is, what it measures, the grades it can be used with, how it's administered, and cost and time. Group B is composed of individuals with statistical and or assessment expertise. They were the ones who judged the technical adequacy of the tool. The technical features such as reliability, validity, classification accuracy for screening tools, and the relevance of the Criterion Measure, actually evaluating the Criterion measures to which the screening and progress tools were being compared. Group C were individuals with big picture expertise. They're the ones that had system-level considerations as their charge. They needed to look at the application, such as the relation of the tool to our state standards, which are largely the Common Core state standards, the needs for professional development, right, the alignment with the core, training time, computer system feasibility, if there were administration and scoring options, and what kind of access that would require, the turnaround time for receiving data or reports back in order to make decisions and alter instruction as needed, and also reviewing the general sample for the validity and classification accuracy studies, ensuring that it was appropriate and aligned with the needs for which the group was evaluating the tool, including considerations such as the disaggregation of data. Within each of those three groups, there were two pairs of individuals, and each pair received a copy of the materials needed to conduct the review. They reviewed and scored their parts as a pair. They then swapped their review with the other pair within their group who also conducted the review on the same tool. Once each pair within a group had conducted their review, they swapped their review with the other pair. They only met with the other group if there was a discrepancy in the scoring. If the two pairs came up with a very similar review of the materials, then that review was put together into the overall package. But if there was a discrepancy, a lead person from one of the other groups participated with both pairs within that group present in order to reconcile the discrepancy in scoring and come to an agreed-upon rating. So what this process allowed was that every tool was reviewed by each member of the work group. So all four members of each group, A, B, and C, reviewed each tool. For the review process, all reviews are to be completed and brought to a full work group meeting. Right now, all of those work group pairs are working at applying the rubrics to the tools that have been collected. Once the reviews are completed, they will be brought together and put into a single document. And so each tool will receive a single document for screening and for progress if needed. Final determinations across the groups for each tool will then be shared with the vetting group. Once the results are compiled, the groups have 2 weeks to get those final determinations to the vetting group. And the vetting group will then have 1 month to review that information and provide feedback to the work group. This is the schedule that will keep the analysis and review of materials moving on pace. So looking at the structure and the rationale of these rubrics that the work groups used, there were separate rubrics for the universal screening and progress monitoring tools. A lot of the tools were reviewed for both because they can be used for both screening and progress. But there are different considerations for whether a tool is appropriate for screening and for progress decisions. So there were 2 separate rubrics. The rubrics do have common header and descriptive information, and the criteria for each group contain common header and descriptive information so that there was a consistency of information across them. But each group, obviously in rating different criteria, had different sets of standards and different information that they were looking at. So for the rest of this webinar, we're going to be going through the tools piece by piece to see what each of the section and each of the criteria look like for the various groups. We'll start with the Universal Screening Rubric. On the cover page, there is this consistent header. On the header, there are 3 questions that everyone, all of the workgroup members that use the rubric, should have a consistent understanding of. It's, in a sense, the mission statement of the screening rubric. So the first question is that, what is a universal screening tool in reading? The core group and the work group came together with feedback from the vetting group to determine what this definition would be of a universal screening tool. There are some slight differences in definition and consideration. They wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page and was understanding the work as it should be. The next question was why to use a universal screening tool. So not just what the tool is, but why it's important to use. Again, something to make sure that whenever someone was interacting with the rubric, they should go through these questions and kind of reset their own perspective and their perceptions of a universal screening tool, why they're important to use. Another piece that was included in the headers was which feature is most critical. And this was put in because the rubric has these evaluative judgments, and in identifying the different criteria, because there are many, the groups felt that identifying which criterion was the most important was another important piece to put in the header so that everybody was, again, staying consistent in their purpose and their procedures of evaluation. So for Group A, their portion of the rubric started out looking like this. There were several descriptive pieces of information. First off, the groups had to determine where they got the information that they used to complete the rubric. There were several different places where they could get it. They could use a manual from the publisher, the NCRTI tool chart, a mental measurement yearbook, Burroughs Institute, any online publisher information, or external information from somewhere, published review, published studies. An important component to examine here is that it requires a minimum of 2. The groups did not want the review pairs to be going through and working off of one source of information, not only the information from the manual from the publisher, not only the mental measurement yearbook review, but 2 separate pieces of information to make sure that there was some consistency there. Looking across the other pieces of information, they also had to write the name of the tool, the areas assessed, and sometimes they had to include the broad and or the narrow, identifying which grade levels all that apply, and how it's administered. Is it a group or individual administration? Down below, the various criteria go through. Looking at the headers, the first column identifies what the various criteria are, or which criterion they'll be focusing on. After describing the criterion, there's a justification. Why is this an important criterion to evaluate? Some of the justification statements provide a little more descriptive information, and some don't provide much at all. It depends on the commonality and the specificity of the criteria. And after that are the scores. Looking across the scores, the groups decided that a 4-point system ranging from 0 to 3 was important. This way, each group can score across all of the criteria on a scale of 0 to 3. And once all of those criteria are scored, they could be totaled up, and the different instruments could be compared as being compared to a standard rubric. 3 is a strong justification of why this would be important, but many of the criteria also include subscores, where if you can't get a full 3 or it's better than a 0, they would provide a half judgment. There's also a piece at the end to kick out a tool. Not every criterion has a kick-out standard, but for the most important criteria, These were the standards that the groups decided if something cost too much or took too long or had technical adequacy that was too poor, it would not be an appropriate tool for this purpose. So these were some of the make or break criteria and the standards within those criteria. So looking down through the various criteria, first we'll examine cost. The cost can vary considerably on whether something is a paper and pencil task or whether it's computer-based or web-based. In making a determination of free, the printing cost or internet access costs, whatever that core infrastructure is, was not considered to be a cost. It was considered assumed. So the cost rating here is only for either ongoing or one-time fees that would be charged in order to gain access to the tools, not the actual administration of the tools. It's only the outlay for usage. The time spent of each student engaging with the tool was also an important consideration because the purpose of these tools, this is for universal screening. The determination was that the tool should not take an individual student away from instruction for too long. Within the confines of the purpose, predicting success to an important outcome, 15 minutes per student was considered a fair amount of time. And so anything lower than 15 minutes was seen as sufficient or good. And the quicker tools can do it while maintaining all of the classification accuracy and technical adequacy, the better. Many of the tools were either less than 10 minutes or more than 20. There seemed to be a bit of a bimodal distribution. So that was the review sheet for Group A. Now, Group B, if you recall, is the technical adequacy statistical evaluative group. In prediction, there are several things that can decrease accuracy. The quality of the screener is often assumed to be the main cause, but if one is predicting to a poor criterion measure, that could be a cause of lower accuracy too. So prediction should be to a meaningful outcome. If the predictor is of poor quality, accuracy may not be as meaningful. If the outcome is of poor quality, then prediction may not be as meaningful. So along those lines, the classification accuracy and the technical adequacy were judged not only for the screening tool, but also for the criterion measure to which the tool was being compared. Looking across the criteria on this sheet, these criteria all require completing additional sheets that we'll look at in a minute. The points presented are based on how well the tool meets the criteria on the other form. So there are a different number of items on each form, each one also rated on the 0 to 3 scale, and so a total number of points across those criteria are included. For the kickouts, if a tool only predicts to itself at a future time or to a different component of itself, maybe to a subtest, or if there are no classification accuracy data, no analysis, the tool was considered to be automatically rejected because those had to be included. If you recall from the header page, classification accuracy was determined to be the most important criterion. So looking at the criterion measures, first off, the criterion measure used for classification accuracy. In the judgment, here's the score going from 0 to 15. There are 5 criteria, with a kickout of the criterion measure not being suitable. The analysis of classification accuracy only includes 3 criteria and is rated on that 0 to 9 scale. However, if no classification accuracy analysis is provided, then the tool is kicked out. And the criterion measure used for the universal screening tool. In some cases, a different criterion measure is used for classification accuracy analysis and for other criterion-related validity analyses. So in those cases, the tool had to be reviewed twice, or the criterion measures had to be reviewed twice with respect to that same tool. So the external sheet for judging the criterion measure starts off with some descriptive information. The Judging the Criterion Measure sheet is the same sheet for both universal screening tools and for progress tools. So first off, identifying what this criterion measure is being judged in relation to: classification accuracy for screening, criterion validity for screening, or progress monitoring was an important consideration, and that's where it got included with the full report. Descriptive information about the measure and how the criterion is administered, group or individual, and again, how the information was gathered and what information was relied upon for making the determinations was all included. At the beginning of the header, the bottom of the header, a description of what an appropriate criterion measure is provided. These are the 5 standards that are then used across the rubric in order to judge the criterion measure. But they're listed here to give a nice summary for the reviewer. So first off, moving down through the criteria, is the criterion measure external to the screening and progress monitoring tool? As you can see here, there are differences in the scoring so that it's not a full 4-point, but really a 3-point scale here. If something is completely external, there's no or little overlap, it's by a different author or publisher, different standardization group, then that was given maximum score. If there's some kind of an overlap, it's still okay, provided that the measure is not a different section of the same test or the same test given at a different time. Those would kick out the review because of an inappropriate criterion measure. The next judgment for the criterion measure is that the criterion should measure a broad skill rather than a specific skill. In this case, it was reading. All of the tools assessed or evaluated were for reading. Under the definition of meaningful, the Common Core State Standards do not focus on a single feature of reading, but a much broader definition that encompasses the 5 components of the National Reading Panel's definition. As such, a meaningful criterion measure for reading should be a broad measure of reading, not one of a single component, even if that component is comprehension, which people may argue is the end goal of reading, but it's still one component, something that needs to be a more omnibus measure of reading. And so that's what's reflected in the standards for judging whether it's a broad skill, broad reading, rather than specific subcomponents of reading. Continuing the judgment of the criterion measure, looking at technical adequacy, comparing standards for reliability and validity. Typically, generally accepted standards for reliability and validity were included. These are similar, if not identical, in most cases to those applied by the NCRTI tools charts. And then the last is that a broad sample was used in the validation and or the norming of the criterion measure. It's something that needs to be nationally representative, whether it's a true national sample or whether it's a sample that includes individuals across states, across regions. The more nationally representative the sample of the criterion measure, the better. Part of the justification here is that we want to be making comparisons to a broad, nationally representative sample. We're looking at the content and the constructs being represented in the Common Core State Standards. The comparison on the criterion measure should be similarly broad. So those are the sections on the judging the criterion measure, the external sheet. The additional sheet for judging classification accuracy includes the 3 sections on area under the curve, specificity, sensitivity, and the lag time between when the assessments are given. Area under the curve is only one metric that can be used to judge how well a tool classifies individuals as proficient, non-proficient, or passing, not passing. There are others, such as kappa, but the determination was made to use the area under the curve for consistency's sake. It is one of the more commonly reported metrics, and when area under the curve is reported, it's also often reported with specificity or sensitivity. And the determination the group made was that a consistent metric should be evaluated so that the comparisons across tools can be made consistently. The standards for determining awk were based on external sources and the same considerations that the NCRTI considered for the screening tools chart. Moving on to sensitivity or specificity. Depending on what the analyses were predicting and how they were conducted, the results might be reported differently from the publisher, from the technical report, or a published article. If the analysis was looking at predicting proficiency, then they may be focusing on sensitivity of the tool. If they were focusing on risk, they might focus on specificity in reporting the same information. There are additional descriptors below that we will go through, and then, in fact, a two-page description and kind of guideline for the workgroup members to go through and to examine for consistency. With that consistency's sake, what they wanted to be predicting was positive performance on both the tool and the criterion measure. So predicting proficiency on the outcome measure and a positive low-risk proficiency on the screening tool. That would provide a consistent comparison across tools. Now, oftentimes that was framed as sensitivity, but for some analyses and for some tools it was framed as specificity. It just depended on the way that the publisher was reporting the information. So similar standards were also used to the area under the curve, but because they were only looking at one or the other, sensitivity or specificity, the lower bounds of the standards are actually a little bit higher, since area under the curve balances sensitivity and specificity. The third consideration was the lag time between when the assessments are given. There's been traditionally a lot of screening measures are administered with a fairly long lag, sometimes 3, 5, 6 months between the screening measure and the criterion measure. But there's been an increasing amount of research looking at what's referred to as lag bias, that particularly when you're looking at skills and measures that are sensitive to instruction, the farther the time between the screening tool and the criterion measure, the more susceptible the analysis is to differential interventions or differential intervention response by different subgroups. So to ensure that the evaluations and the comparisons were as consistent as possible, it was determined that we'd want to see short lags. Under 2 weeks is the best, but with increasing time periods for judging that time lag between screening and criterion measure. Looking at the sensitivity and specificity considerations, these are some of the details. First off, there's an explanation. What is sensitivity? What is specificity? Within the context, what does true mean? True positives, true negatives, all in relation to the prediction. So sensitivity is ideally the true positives, the individuals that were predicted to be positive on the screening tool and were positive on the criterion measure, divided by the total number of accurate prediction, true positives and false negatives. So that this way, we see what proportion of individuals were actually predicted to be true when they should have been true. This was the basic explanation that was included on the sheet with various examples given, because there are different considerations, and that has to do with how the publisher is reporting the information. So in looking for positive, if the publisher is looking to predict deficiency or risk, non-proficiency, then as they report a positive prediction. It may be positively predicting a negative outcome, such as failure or non-proficiency. So in those cases, it was important to ensure what it was that the publisher was trying to predict and how that would relate to other tools and to what it was the work group was evaluating. So across the different considerations, if the publisher reports the results in a 2x2 matrix, classifying every individual as positive or negative on the screening, proficient, non-proficient, say, and positive or negative on the outcome measure, then focusing on sensitivity and specificity allowed these two considerations. So that sensitivity is shown by the ovals and solid lines under Figure 1A, so that the positive square in the 2x2 matrix is the numerator, and the left column, the positive outcome, is the denominator. The dotted ovals represent specificity. So if the publisher is reporting their information this way, that's where the sensitivity and specificity would show up in that table. Figure 1B demonstrates the opposite prediction. Negative to negative is the main focus. So in this case, it's where sensitivity is actually representing a negative, at-risk, deficient performance on the screening tool, predicting the negative outcome. And so in this case, sensitivity and specificity are as the publisher is relating them, are predicting the opposite thing. So figures 1A and 1B are important to make a comparison to, so that the rating group is using sensitivity the same way when evaluating the various tools. The next consideration is when a developer may include a third category, which consider unknown, need further information, so that they can predict the positive or negative outcome or performance. But there's also a third group of not able to be predicted quite as reliably. So in this case, this is where the sensitivity and specificity would be illustrated in this kind of table. What you can see looking at figures 2A and 2B is they are presented the same way as figures 1A and 1B, except the third category is included. So when looking at sensitivity and specificity, that third category is included in the denominator of calculation of sensitivity or specificity. The third category in the screening measure is included. The outcome measure and its third category is not included in either the sensitivity or specificity analyses. So those are the representatives of the sensitivity, solid line ovals, and specificity, dotted line ovals. There is one third consideration, and in some cases the table is presented in a different way. And what we wanted to do on the tools is to highlight the fact that you need to make sure which way screening and criterion measures are presented, because it would push the sensitivity and the specificity analyses in different ways. Some of the publishers were very good in reporting information in some 2x2 or 3x3 table, so that their definition and their usage of sensitivity and specificity could be very explicitly determined. It could also go back and figure out where it was and how it was that they calculated it. But with some others, they reported the core information, and it was up to the team to kind of backtrack to see how that information was calculated, was computed. Getting back to the main document for Group B for the screening tool, once those additional sheets have been completed, The screening tool is rated on additional technical characteristics. Criterion validity is commonly reported for any assessment tool. Different forms of reliability should be too. The standards for criterion validity are fairly common, industry standards for assessment tools, with a kick-out that includes not providing information or very poor criterion-related validity. Reliability on the universal screening tool was included of looking across reliability estimates that include the test scores. Are the scores stable across items, across forms, so that alternate form, split half, coefficient alpha, any other internal consistency would be included within this criterion. The standards are the same across the three, and whichever one or ones are reported can be circled and identified. It is possible under this rating to come up with different considerations. If the alternate form is greater than 0.8, but split half is between 0.7 and 0.8, that would be an indication of, should it be 3 points or 2 points? And in this case, the work group would often split the middle, take a rating of 2.5 in order to try to best represent the results. And again, there's a kick-out. If there is no evidence of reliability provided, then that was a problem, because we have no understanding of how technically adequate, how reliable the tool might be. Under reliability, inter-rater or inter-score reliability was included as a separate item, because the development team decided that the standards for inter-rater reliability needed to be higher than other types of reliability. The reasoning was that if a tool is too difficult to score consistently, then the information provided cannot be sufficiently accurate for sufficient decision making, that it would lead to too many erroneous decisions that could be prevented by using a tool where the inter-rater or inter-score reliability was much higher. So the standards for inter-rater reliability not only much higher, but the kick-out is set much higher than other forms. For Group C, their rubric, their set of criteria to evaluate screening tools, it began with a comparison of the tool to the Iowa Core standards, which are largely the Common Core state standards, with a few areas where a combination of the former Iowa Core and the Common Core state standards were incorporated. If the content assessed by a universal screening tool is not directly aligned with a standard, a tool might face a lot of opposition. It might be difficult to justify. Some people refer to that as potentially having poor face validity. The intent here was not to use proxy measures that might be adequate, but to find direct measures of components of the state standards that serve as sufficient predictors of the meaningful criterion. The more directly a measure aligns with the content for the prediction, the more likely that it can and will provide an accurate prediction. And so within the justification section of alignment with the core, the critical areas of the Iowa Core were listed here for easy reference, to make sure that the work group could compare them and identify which one a tool might be tapping most directly. Other system-level considerations include the training. Again, even if a tool is good, if it takes too long to train people to use it appropriately, then there's a diminishing cost-benefit ratio. And too much training was seen as something that would actually inhibit a tool's usage. It would make it more difficult for people to feel comfortable with it, and might create a bit of difficulty in having to take a lot of time to learn how to consistently implement the tool. The computer application was determined to be a big plus, but only if the administration, scoring, and data management were not in a single unified system. Since the state is developing its own data system and will need to incorporate that tool, if all of the application, scoring, data management are a single system that does not allow for easy export to another system, that would actually make usage of the tool more difficult. And the data would have to be downloaded from the data management system and then re-uploaded into the state system, obviously making the efficiency much less. The ease of scoring and the ease of administration is also something taken into account. But again, making sure that the data reporting, the data administration are simple, are efficient, and that the educators can get the results or interpretations quickly. Something that is administered and scored right there and sitting with the child, whether it's computer administered or paper and pencil, is something that would provide a very efficient means of gathering, receiving, and interpreting the data. And the more distal the reporting, the less efficient the system winds up being. Other considerations for Group C are then the data retrieval. As I was mentioning, is this something where they receive the data instantaneously? Would it be the same day? Or is it something where they have to send the data out and it comes back more than a week later? Whether that sending out is to a central system, whether it's central to the district or central to the publisher, it's something that separates the educator, the students, and the information needed to make decisions. And so, again, this kind of a time lag was determined to be important to be as short as possible. Group C was also considering the sample. Does the tool, the analyses of the tool, the reliability, the validity, all of the technical adequacy considerations, was it sufficiently representative? Now, although this was something that may have been incorporated in with Group B as they were examining the reliability and validity analyses, Group C was bringing this out because of the system-level considerations. They need to look at what the sample for the tool was in which all of these technical adequacy studies were conducted, but also make the comparisons to national representativeness, cross-state or cross-region representativeness, and how that also relates to Iowa representativeness. Making sure that the sample is sufficiently broad, but making sure that analyses were also included where they disaggregated the data, ensuring that the tool was not providing consistently biased information for one group or another. So the more disaggregations and the stronger those disaggregated analyses, the better. And this is the end of Group C's rubric. This is the end of the screening rubric. So at the end, these were the Group A, Group B, Group C, in additional to the two sheets that Group B included of Criterion Measure and classification accuracy. All of those were incorporated into a single universal screening rubric for a tool. The progress monitoring rubric looks similar in a lot of ways. And so one of those is looking on the cover page. There's a header with only 2 questions this time, but why use progress monitoring tools? To make sure that everyone implementing the rubric had a consistent consideration for why they're important, but also looking at what is the feature that's most crucial for progress monitoring. And because the definition of progress monitoring used includes ongoing progress monitoring with repeated administration, a sufficient number of equivalent forms was determined to be the most crucial feature. A tool that is otherwise okay but does not have sufficient forms still would not be very useful as a progress monitoring tool. And similar to the screening rubric, there are kickouts on various criteria. So after the header, there are also descriptive information that each group section look at, how they got the information that they used to judge the tool, including a minimum of 2 sources, just like on the screening rubric, and descriptive information about the name, the areas, the grades, consideration of the Criterion Measure, and how the progress tool is administered. Group A's evaluation then moves into the various criteria, starting off with the number of equivalent forms. Because of the potential need to administer the tool frequently and repeatedly, there need to be a number of sufficient forms. The group determined that 20 or more alternate forms would be great, and a decreasing number from there, because of the need for progress tools to be sensitive to learning, to growth. Having fewer than 10 forms considered to be a potential concern. If an educator is needing to administer a form once or twice a week, this may not be a sufficient number of forms to cover even a round of intervention, much less a semester or a school year. And so fewer than 10 forms or 9 forms, the progress tool would be kicked out of first-level review for consideration. All of the tools that were kicked out because of one criterion or another were considered for full review and went through a full review, but they weren't moved into a top-tier group where they were evaluated for adoption statewide. The other considerations are exactly the same as with the screening tool. The cost, student engagement, and the standards involved are also the same, primarily because if the same tool can be used for both screening and progress, then the same criteria need to be applied. For Group B gets a different set of technical characteristics again. Whereas Group A evaluated the number of equivalent forms, Group B started off evaluating the equivalence of those alternate forms. So there are a variety of ways that equivalence of alternate forms can be determined, can be judged. Some of these are listed here, and what the team really wanted to see is, were they addressed in multiple ways, or at least one way, and how so? I mean, was there a strong justification that these alternate forms are in fact equivalent? If there's no indication of the equivalency of forms, then no matter how many alternate forms there are, it's difficult to say that they're measuring the same thing or measuring in any consistent way. Again, the Criterion Measure was judged. It was using the same sheet as the screening tool, the additional sheet for judgment of the Criterion Measure. For those tools that were evaluated both for the screening rubric and through the progress rubric, because of the slight difference in analyses, there may actually be different criterion measures. And so in this case, sometimes Group B would have to evaluate a different criterion measure in relation to the same tool. And then they moved on to the technical adequacy. For progress tools, the validity and reliability were considered in terms of both the performance score, sometimes considered the level of performance, and the slope, the rate of growth over time. Validity was judged first. Validity of the performance score was used or was evaluated with the same criteria as validity on the screening metric. And in fact, the validity of the performance score on the progress tool, if it's also evaluated for screening, oftentimes was similar. There may be a slight difference between usage of a tool for screening and for progress, in that you may administer 3 versions and take the mean or the median, rather than for progress, where the level of performance might be calculated on a single administration. So there were some of those differences, but in general, looking at the validity of the performance score for progress, it's like looking at the criterion and related validity for the screening tool. Next, looking at the reliability of the performance score. Similarly, the reliability of the level of the performance score is often the same as for screening if the tool was evaluated for both. For the progress rubric, two types of reliability needed to be reported, and both needed to be adequate to acceptable standards. Again, you can see inter-rater reliability had a higher standard than do the other forms. Rather than separating the reliability of the performance score into two different categories, they were incorporated into one so that reliability of the performance score is a single determination. Next, reliability of the slope was evaluated. It needs to be calculated on a sufficient number of repeated administrations so that it's consistent with the definition used for progress. And there were also considerations of how the reliability for the slope might be calculated. So within the justification, there's a little bit of a description of what to look for and how to judge it, and see the standards for coefficients. But also right below that box on the form is a key, right? So that knowing all of the different acronyms that might be used in the analyses are included, and a short summary of what they are, what they're describing, and why they would be important means of calculating reliability of the slope. So then Group C made many of the same determinations for progress as they did for the universal screening. Most of the criteria are actually the same for both tools, but not necessarily. So the group was required to be aware of that and to focus on what they were judging, the criteria. But looking at alignment of the core, so because oftentimes it was the same tool for progress and screening, it was the same comparison to the core, and the standards for the core are the same. The training required was also considered to be an important consideration, and the standards are similar. Same thing for computer application. Having a computer application, whether it's for administration, scoring, and or data management, was seen as a strong plus and something that is an important consideration in the state and across the country. The last few sections are data administration and scoring. How difficult, how time-consuming is it to administer and score the data, and the data retrieval. How quickly can the educators get the results, the report, making sure that there is not a long time lag there. And last but not least, looking at the sample for comparison. Again, often the same analyses, the same comparisons for both screening and progress, and different purposes of the same tool, but important considerations that Group C made sure that the sample was sufficiently broad, of national or cross-regional, and that disaggregation of the data and the analyses was conducted and was representative. Some of the findings from applying the rubrics, although these are only preliminary because the reviews have not been completed, many of the tools that were reported as being used may not or are not sufficient or appropriate for universal screening or progress monitoring. There isn't enough technical adequacy information to necessarily support their use for these purposes. Some tools are appropriate for both screening and progress monitoring. However, it's seeming that no tool, at least the ones reviewed so far, is perfect, but it's not expected that any tool will be perfect. There are alternatives from which to choose. Some tools that are determined to be appropriate for both screening and progress monitoring, but also are being rated high enough across the groups that they look like suitable alternatives. So thank you very much for your time and your attention. If you are interested in more information, there will be a live chat The National Center on RTI will host the chats on Thursday, April 26th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And you're welcome to join me then. We can have further discussion on the issues and the process. So again, thank you for your time.